Okay, this is section 3, Rahula, the Bodhisattva ideal in Buddhism from Gems of Buddhist Wisdom. Let's read it and we'll analyze it. We learn from the Abhidharma Samayaka, an authoritative Mahayana philosophical text, 4th century AD, that the terms Vitulya and Vipula are synonymous, and that Vipula is the Bodhisattva Pitaka. Now, the Bodhisattva Pitaka is definitely Mahayana, hence Vitulya undoubtedly denotes Mahayana. So we can be certain that the terms Vitanda and Vitula used in the Pali chronicles and commentaries refer to Mahayana. But the terms Hinayana and Mahayana were not known to them, or ignored, or unrecognized by them. It's universally accepted by scholars that the terms Hinayana and Mahayana are later inventions. Historically speaking, Theravada already existed long before these terms came into being. That Theravada, considered to be the original teaching of the Buddha, was introduced to Ceylon and established there in the 3rd century BC during the time of Emperor Asoka of India. So what just is the Abhidharma Samayukya? So there are two brothers who are the guys who create Yogacara. And in the 4th century, one of the brothers, called Asanga, discovers, finds, receives a sacred revelation, sacred text. And the text is a psychologically orientated compendium of Mahayana Abhidharma. Provides a framework as well as a general pattern as how a practitioner is to follow the presumably Yogacara path to develop oneself and finally attain Buddhahood. Refers to a collection which contains the Agmas, a group of texts in the Pali, including the Pali Canon, as the Stravaka Kaptika, and associates it with the Stravakas and Prakya Buddhas. Sangha classifies the Mahayana Sutras, the 8,000 lines, etc., to the Heart Sutra, so maybe 100 BC to 500, 600 AD, as belonging to this generic title, Bodhi Attva Pitaka, which is designated as the collection of teachings for the Bodhisattvas, in the same way as the Pali literature, I guess, is that sort of collective term. I better just highlight that text, the Abhidharma Samayuka. So what's next? Why is Rahula quoting an original Mahayana text by Asanga? Remember, he's Mahayana, not Mahayana, he's Theravada, quoting an authoritative Mahayana text. Here again, his intention, it seems, is to use this text to argue polemically both that Mahayana originated as a sect, as a schism, as a breakaway group, as that was heresy, that was driven out of the pure Sangha, possibly that Mahayana, its salvation, soteriological claims are not coherent and therefore not true. He talks about the terms Vitya, Yula, Vitya, Ya are synonymous. Well, are they, and does it matter? Probably not quite true that the terms Vityula and Vipula are exactly. They are broadly synonymous, if you do linguistic studies. What they indicate is a heretical sect that some identify with Mahayana. Not all scholars agree, and this is disputed. While this may be the case, it might also be the case that there were heretics who are not necessarily proto-Mahayana heretics. They may have different beliefs. This is about chest thumping, claiming Mahayana always has been rejected by legitimate Theravada leaders as just not true and an aberration. Is the Vipayula the Bodhisattva Pitaka? And so what? That Vipayula is the Bodhisattva Pitaka. So a Sangha is thought in the 4th century that the Bodhisattva Pitaka represents an umbrella term for Mahayana. In his thought, Mahayana scriptures and the teaching of the scriptures, the Vipayula, however, represents at best part of this larger body of diverse perspectives. It's only part. There are 9 Mahayana sutras at least, probably more. Rahula wants to forget the complexity and again to paint the Mahayanas as small, breakaway, few, not major schism in the Sangha that it actually was. So is the Bodhisattva Pitaka definitely Mahayana rhetoric? And what is the rhetoric nature of definitely? He says, the Bodhisattva Pitaka is definitely Mahayana. Rahula is making this increasingly tenuous causal kind of source criticism connections by proof texting, trying to amplify his point, arguing polemically from the opposition's own sources of authority. So, i.e., if a Sangha said it, it must be true. You guys must believe a Sangha. And a Sangha definitely said this. Definitely you must agree. This is clever exegetical rhetoric. But it seems more eisegesis, reading into the text what you want to find, than exegesis. Legitimately expounding his view. This is a somewhat tendacious argument, as the term Bodhisattva Pitaka is used in various almost mythical ways in Mahayana to refer to a number of things. The treatise, in which the term Bodhisattva Pitaka is applied to Mahayana scripture as a whole. It's used to refer to sources that identify the Bodhisattva Pitaka as a distinct collection of works on the Bodhisattva ideal. The sources that associate the Bodhisattva Pitaka with the traditional 6 paramita and related practices. It's referring to the Mahayana texts that refer to a specific work called the Bodhisattva Pitaka Sutra. It seems Rahula is assuming this last sense of an extant text, which allows him to speculate on its contents. So what about the rhetoric nature of undoubtedly? Hence, Vitula undoubtedly denotes, undoubtedly, how strong, Mahayana. So his proof text, eisegesis arguments, conclusion being that the Sangha, key Mahayana source of authority, believed the few monks kicked out of Sri Lanka and all their few adherents to be all there is to heretical Mahayana India. No doubt, no doubt. So, he says, so we can be certain. Well, can we? Can we be certain? He keeps telling us to trust him, but should we? I've got no agenda. Of course he doesn't. So while the chronicles do give us a history of the doctrinal disputes and excommunications from the Vihar and the island of certain monks, that the emerging Mahayana movement might later be identified with, these early heretics, it's unsurprising, but that's a leap to go from unproven reading of an extant text to this. The corruption of the bhikkhus by Vitanda is recorded in the Dipavamsa, and how the Vitula books were burnt and heretics, bhikkhus, disgraced. But is it certain? Can you trust him? Is it undoubtable? I think he's saying these things too much, too often. So what if the terms Hinayana and Mahayana were not known to them or ignored, unrecognized by them? Hinayana and Mahayana were not known, ignored, or unrecognized by them. More likely the latter, unrecognized. Rahula is dismissive that his authorial sources were interested or aware the very existence of Mahayana as a separate sect. This is probably an overworked point. He said it several times. When Rahula later, says later, when exactly is that, and why does it matter? Universally accepted by scholars that the terms Hinayana are later inventions. Depends what later is. If it's AD 200, and later is actually quite early in terms of the polemics. Jan Nattier argues the origin is not between unnamed groups, but a conflict between the Bodhisattva and Stravaka ideals. These are amorphous things in competition, both having significant numbers of adherents and going back to the earliest councils, in effect. Remember, Theravada is just as much as Mahayana wasn't a name in use until much later. The group existed, but it coexisted, and both groups coexisted in the same institutions. So why can he say Theravada as a label was history, but Mahayana does not? Is it sauce for the goose, not sauce for the gander? Theravada already existed long before the terms came into being. Well, couldn't you say the same about Mahayana? And the reality is, no, it didn't, and neither did Mahayana. And identifying the Stravaka or Way of the Elders with the 5th century, for example, Theravada commentator of the Pali Canon Buddha Ghosha is not persuasive, wouldn't be persuasive to Bashan and other scholars. Some Williams even argues like the word really only makes sense in the 20th century. Wow, Theravada is a 20th century word. Yes, there were some features of early schools similar to modern Theravada, but that's a long way from saying that they were Theravadan. The claim could be made of Mahayana. So what are the multiple problems with claiming Theravada is the original teaching of the Buddha? Here it is. Theravada to be considered the what? Original teaching of the Buddha. Here it is, the claim out and bold and clear to the right to be called original and hence orthodox and true Buddhism. And it's an exclusivist claim. And it's a strategy. This Basham and Western scholars would reject as authoritarian. Knowing what the Buddha specifically taught after 300 years of oral tradition, 36 schools of early Buddhism, schism and division, at least 3 different councils occurring, orthodoxy and heresy, is not straightforward at the very least in the way that he's describing. And textual analysis helps, but it's far from certain. Far from certain. Where is Ceylon and why is it important? Well, it's introduced to Ceylon and established there. Rahula is claiming that modern Theravada was the faith of the 3rd century Buddha Asoka, the king Asoka, and that what he sent to Ceylon, or Sri Lanka, is just mythology. And we don't even really know how Buddhism got to Sri Lanka. And it does really not follow from previous arguments. We could argue that Asoka's council privileged a conservative reading of the Dharma, and that the points of dispute text, which is added to the Abhidharma Pitaka, perhaps gives us an indication of what this is. And the missions to Sri Lanka during his reign certainly happened. Whether his fabled son went, that's another thing, and so on. So this was section 3.